objection?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 15 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the Senate floor as I have week after week since we passed the health care law, giving a doctor's second opinion of the health care law. And I come today because last month President Obama delivered a very big speech on spending. Unfortunately, it seemed to me to be more of a political attack than a substantive speech offering a detailed plan to attack America's debt crisis. Well, the President did, however, mention one bit of substance that really should raise a red flag for the American people. The President said, he said, quote, "We will slow the growth of Medicare costs by strengthening an independent commission," close quote. We will slow the growth of Medicare costs by strengthening an independent commission. Well, the Washington Commission that he's referring to is called the Independent Payment Advisory Board. This board may sound harmless, but let me assure you the American people deserve to know and have a right to know more details about the board and about its work. Many Americans may not remember that the health care law created this unelected, unaccountable board of Washington full-time bureaucrats. The sole purpose of the board is to cut Medicare spending based on arbitrary budget targets, not based on the number of people on Medicare, not based on the number of seniors, based on arbitrary budget targets. These are cuts above and beyond the $500 billion already taken from a nearly bankrupt Medicare program during the health care law. Taken $500 billion from Medicare, from our seniors on Medicare, not to save Medicare, but to start a whole new government program. And now the President wants to slow the growth of Medicare costs by strengthening this independent commission. Well, this board empowers 15 unelected Washington bureaucrats to make these Medicare cuts, all without full transparency and the accountability to the American seniors and also to elected officials. Once again, this board proves that the President and the Democrats in Congress who voted for the health care law simply didn't have the political courage to make tough spending decisions. Instead, they took the easy road and pulled a classic Washington maneuver. They created a board and then punted the tough decisions to the board. Well, this forced Congress to abdicate two important congressional duties. First is the constitutional responsibility to manage Medicare spending. The second is the responsibility to explain to the American people why specific payment changes might be necessary to keep Medicare afloat. All because the President and Washington Democrats refused to lead. They simply threw up their hands and said, let someone else deal with it. Well, if expanding this independent board is, and they call it independent, but I'm not so convinced that it is, but it's called the Independent Payment Advisory Board, if expanding this board is the one and only concrete proposal that the President has to reform Medicare and reduce the debt, and most Americans may never have even heard of it, then it's important that we take the time on the Senate floor today to discuss exactly how this board works and the impact that it will have on medical care in America. Now, I call this the top 10 things that you need to know about the Independent Payment Advisory Board. Now, to me, this issue is so important that I plan to talk about 5 of them today and then to come back next week as part of a doctor's second opinion on the health care law and talk about the next 5. Number 1. This board is how Washington will limit patient care. When Congressman Paul Ryan offered his 2012 budget plan, the President and members of his party launched an all-out media assault on Medicare spending. The White House and Democrats used inflammatory and patently false statements to scare people about the Ryan plan. What they failed to mention, however, is that the President's own health care law actually has significant caps on Medicare spending. To enforce the caps, the President and Washington Democrats went with their tried and true solution: create another board. Well, what does all this mean for people currently on Medicare and for future Medicare patients? Well, a centralized Washington board will arbitrarily cut payments to Medicare providers, doctors, nurses, people taking care of patients. What they're going to do is they will squeeze Medicare savings by cutting provider payments and treatment options, which will punish patients. Why are they doing this? To start a whole new government program, not for the people that paid into Medicare, but for a different whole group of people. So not only will medical professionals facing these cuts decide to simply stop seeing Medicare patients, and we see that today, Mr. President. I mean, frankly, doctors are running away from Medicare, not wanting to see Medicare patients. Well, individuals, families will watch, helpless, as a Washington bureaucrat decides what kind of treatments that person can have. Number two, this board, they're going to make recommendations, and those recommendations will automatically become law. So how can that be? Something that a board does automatically becomes law? But their spending recommendations automatically become law unless Congress acts to stop it. And if Congress would actually want to stop the board's policies, there are very few options. The options are severely limited. Overriding the requirements of overriding these boards' recommendation requires a 3/5 majority in the Senate. It's a high hurdle to jump. Or Congress can pass a different Medicare spending plan, but there's a catch. It still has to meet the same arbitrary spending target. So if Congress does nothing, then Health and Human Service Secretary Kathleen Sebelius will implement the board's plan. Well, Mr. President, Medicare consumes about 13% of the federal budget, and former Office of Management and Budget Director Peter Orszag called this board, quote, the largest yielding of sovereignty from Congress since the creation of the Federal Reserve. Let me say that again, Mr. President. The former director of the Office of Management and Budget, Peter Orszag, called this board the largest yielding of sovereignty from Congress since the creation of the Federal Reserve. The bottom line is this board isn't making recommendations to Congress. This board is passing law. Well, Congress doesn't have to approve of these policies of the board, and the President doesn't have to sign them. They are law. This represents an unprecedented shift of power from the legislative branch of the federal government to an unelected board of 15 bureaucrats. Number three, the policies of this board cannot be challenged in court. On April 19th of this year, the New York Times published an article titled, Obama Panel to Curb Medicare Finds Foes in Both Parties. This article explains that, in general, federal courts could not review actions to carry out the board's recommendations. Let me repeat. The health care law blocks patient lawsuits against this board's bureaucratic decisions. Well, there's an institute in Arizona called Arizona's Goldwater Institute. They filed a lawsuit against the law based in part on this payment advisory board. Part of the suit says, quote, Congress has no constitutional power to delegate nearly unlimited legislative power to any federal executive branch agency, much less to entrench health care legislation against review, debate, revision, or repeal. Such federal overreaching must be rejected if the principles of limited government and the separation of powers established by the United States Constitution mean anything. That's what the lawsuit says. Well, let's go to number four. This board's mission is to cut provider payments. The board is strictly limited in what it can do to achieve Medicare spending reductions. By law, the board can't raise revenue by increasing taxes. It can't increase patient cost-sharing methods like premiums, co-payments, and deductibles. And it can't alter Medicare eligibility or benefit package. So what can it do? Well, one thing and one thing only. It will adjust provider reimbursement rates. Now, we all know Medicare payments are already well below market rates. So, that's why so many doctors are limiting the number of Medicare patients they see, and in more severe cases, refusing to treat Medicare patients at all. Well, additional subjective cuts to Medicare will not make the program more efficient or more available. These measures will simply reduce the supply of medical care to the Medicare patients of America. The Medicare Chief Actuary, Richard Foster, warned us that the health care law's Medicare cuts will cause providers to leave the program. And we are seeing that today, Mr. President. And it isn't because they don't want to treat Medicare patients. It's because the doctors know that the payments will be too low to even cover their costs. Mr. Foster, the Medicare Chief Actuary, has said that approximately 15% of our nation's hospitals would drop out of Medicare in 10 years. And then number 5, this board could eventually impact all patients, not just Medicare patients. Washington Democrats have long supported policies that give government more power to set health care prices, not just in public programs like Medicare, but also in the private sector. President Bill Clinton asked for this authority in a 1994 debate on what at the time was called Hillary Care. It was one reason that his effort failed. Well, President Obama learned from that failure. Make no mistake, he wants to achieve the same objective. This time, he is using this board as a Trojan horse to sell it. If President Obama's health care law remains the law of the land, millions of Americans will have government-subsidized health insurance. Paying for this new entitlement program will cost trillions. It will be no surprise when we inevitably hear cries for increased cost control. This is when the President will make his move, proposing to extend this board's reach beyond Medicare to the new health care law's subsidized insurance premiums. Last month, the President opened the door to this strategy when he proposed in his speech to expand this board's power and its control over Medicare. And that is why, Mr. President, I come to the Senate floor each and every week to deliver a doctor's second opinion about the health care law, a law that I believe is bad for patients, bad for providers, the nurses and the doctors who take care of those patients, and bad for our taxpayers. And I believe, Mr. President, the more the American people discover about this so-called independent payment advisory board, the more unpopular the President's health care law will become. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and notice the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak in support of the confirmation of Professor Goodwin Liu to the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. As a member of the Judiciary Committee for the past 2 years, I've had the opportunity to meet with Professor Liu and vote on his nomination on several occasions. He is a singularly talented individual, and I want to associate myself with the remarks that all of my colleagues have made in support of his confirmation. But the strongest arguments I've heard in support of Professor Liu haven't come from my colleagues. In fact, they haven't even come from a Democrat. No, the most persuasive arguments I've heard for confirming Professor Liu have come from the former chief ethics lawyer for the administration of George W. Bush, a gentleman named Richard Painter. Professor Painter, a Republican, is now a prominent law professor at the University of Minnesota. Earlier this year, Professor Painter wrote a lengthy article that systematically cataloged Professor Liu's strengths and systematically answered his critics. This is his conclusion, and I quote, "In sum, Liu is eminently qualified. He has support from prominent conservatives. He is pragmatic and open-minded, not dogmatic or ideological. Many, though by no means all, of his scholarly views do not align with conservative ideology or with the policy positions of many elected officials in the Republican Party. Nevertheless, his views are part of the American legal mainstream. The independence, rigor, and fair-mindedness of his writings support a confident prediction that he will be a dutiful and impartial judge," unquote. Now, when I circulated Professor Painter's article to the members of the Judiciary Committee, my Republicans sent me a series of articles critiquing Professor Liu. I would like to take a few moments to rebut the criticisms in these articles because they simply don't hold water. The first and most common criticism of Goodwin Liu is that he somehow believes in a so-called living constitution. Excuse me. His opponents are especially worried about his suggestion that interpreting the Constitution, judges should consider the, quote, "evolving norms and traditions of our society," unquote. Professor Liu has written an entire book about his theory of constitutional interpretation. On page 2 of that book, he writes that we need to consider a lot of different things when we interpret the Constitution. We need to consider the original understanding of the framers. We need to consider the purpose and structure of the Constitution. We need to consider precedent. We need to consider the practical consequences of our laws. And lastly, we need to consider the evolving norms and traditions of our society. So this is just one thing that we should take into account. But even more importantly, this idea that we should merely consider the evolving standards of our society in interpreting the Constitution is not a radical idea. In fact, it isn't even a new idea. This issue frequently comes up in Fourth Amendment cases. Over 40 years ago, in a 1967 case called U.S. v. Katz, the Supreme Court was asked to determine whether a wiretap constituted a search under the Fourth Amendment. If it did, law enforcement would have to get a warrant to get a wiretap. The problem, of course, is that the founders never anticipated the telephone, let alone the wire to the telephone. So this was a new question for the court, but the court voted 7-1 to find that a wiretap was, in fact, a search under the Fourth Amendment. And one of the main reasons they cited was that people in modern society had come to expect and assume that their phones were private. 2 years later, in a separate case called Smith v. Maryland, the court formally adopted the rule that the Fourth Amendment will protect people where our society recognizes a reasonable expectation of privacy. So for 40 years, it has been the law of this land that you have to look at social norms when interpreting the Fourth Amendment. Here's another example, one that Senator Feinstein cited, but still it bears repeating. This is what Chief Justice Marshall said about the necessary and proper cause in McCulloch v. Maryland. Quote, "This provision is made in a constitution intended to endure for ages to come, and consequently to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs." McCulloch v. Maryland was decided in 1819. So the idea that we should merely consider the state of our society when we interpret the Constitution isn't new. It's old. It's really old. Very, very old. In fact, it's arguably older than the Senate chamber that we're standing in today, which first opened in 1859. Professor Liu's detractors have also accused him of believing that judges may, quote, legitimately invent constitutional rights to a broad range of social welfare goods, including education, shelter, subsistence, and health care. That's the accusation. This argument is based on an article Professor Liu wrote in 2008. But if you actually read the article, you'll find this statement right in the introduction. This is a quote from the article. "Because the existence of any welfare right depends on democratic instantiation of our shared understandings, the judiciary is generally limited to an interstitial role within the context of a legislative program. Courts do not act as first movers in establishing welfare rights." So that's unquote. So in other words, Professor Liu is being accused of saying that judges can invent welfare rights because of an article he wrote where he said that judges cannot invent welfare rights. The final thing I want to address is the idea that Professor Liu somehow supports, quote, using foreign law to redefine the Constitution. Professor Liu's critics cite an obscure speech that he gave at a Japanese law school 5 years ago. According to his critics, he said in this speech that it is, quote, difficult for him to grasp how anyone could resist the use of foreign authority in American constitutional law. Well, I went and got a copy of the speech. And if you read it, you'll see that Professor Liu was referring to a series of Supreme Court decisions written by Justice Anthony Kennedy, where Justice Kennedy reviewed the laws of foreign countries on certain issues. Justice Kennedy didn't use the laws of foreign countries to decide the case before him. He used them to get a sense of how other countries were resolving the legal issues before him. Professor Liu was basically saying that he found it difficult to grasp how people could disagree with Justice Kennedy. He has repeatedly said in his testimony under oath that he does not believe that foreign law should be binding in any way on federal law. There are other critiques against Professor Liu. I won't go into them further here, but I urge my colleagues to dig behind these blanket statements. To paraphrase Gertrude Stein, I think you will find that there is no there there. I think what my colleagues will find is an extraordinary intellect, a fundamentally decent man, and someone who will be a strong and impartial jurist. I urge my colleagues to vote for cloture and to vote to support his nomination. And, Mr. President, I also rise today to talk about a Minnesota icon. Minnesotans and baseball fans across this country are celebrating the life of Harmon Killebrew today. We lost a great slugger, Harmon Killebrew, yesterday. I never met Mr. Killebrew, which is kind of hard for me to believe because, like so many Minnesotans, I felt that I knew him. He was the heart of the Minnesota Twins franchise, not just because of the towering home runs that he hit, but because on and off the field he carried himself with so much dignity and grace and humility. I was 9 years old when the old Washington Senators moved to Minnesota and became the Minnesota Twins. We were so excited to have a major league team in Minnesota, and Killebrew was the heart and the anchor of the franchise, batting cleanup and cracking out 400-foot-plus home runs with his unbelievably powerful swing. By 1965, Killebrew, along with Tony Oliva and Zoilo Versailles, Bob Allison, Earl Batty, Jim Perry, Jim Cott, and Mudcat Grant unseated the Yankee dynasty and took the American League pennant. I was sitting along the left field line at Metropolitan Stadium the game before the All-Star break that year when Killebrew hit a ninth-inning walk-off homer to beat the Yankees. It was not a typical Killebrew home run. It was a line drive that just shot out of the park into the left field stands, and it sent us into the All-Star break in first place, and I, along with lots of Twins fans, believe that it was that blow that was the key to the season. Now, as I said, that rope of a homer was not a typical Killebrew home run. He was known for these towering blasts. I remember one in particular. I was watching the Twins on TV one summer night with my dad and my brother. Twins were playing the Tigers in Detroit in the old Tiger Stadium. And Killebrew got a hold of one, and it cleared the left field roof. One of just 4 shots that cleared that roof in the 87-year history of the stadium. My recollection is that by its trajectory, the ball was estimated to be a 480-foot home run. Killebrew hit the longest ball in the history of Metropolitan Stadium in Bloomington, Minnesota, a 530-foot shot. Now, Killebrew was not that big a man. He was 5'11", about 210 pounds. In his major league career, Harmon Killebrew hit 573 home runs, all without the aid of steroids. Killebrew grew up in rural Idaho. According to one press account that I read last night, Killebrew claimed to have gotten his strength from carrying 10-gallon milk cans during the summers as a youth. But I know a little something secondhand about where the power for those home runs really came from: his legs. See, about 20 years ago, a friend of mine did a little film with Killebrew, and he traveled to Killebrew's home in Idaho. And my friend asked Killebrew where his power came from, and Harmon said that it came from his legs. And Killebrew told my friend that the Killebrews all had incredibly powerful legs. And he told my friend that Killebrew's father, Killebrew's father, could jump over a cow from a standing position. Now, I had always hoped to meet Killebrew and ask him about that. And I had a chance to. In 2005, there was a commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the 1965 Twins pennant-winning team. It was held in a tent outside the Metrodome after a game. I was in the tent, and I got Tony Oliva's autograph and Camille Pasquale's autograph, and I saw Killebrew, and he was surrounded by fans. And I just wanted to give him a little space at that time, and he was a totally accessible guy. Every Twins fan knew that, who, from his years on the team and his years in the broadcast booth. But for some reason, I decided to talk to another member of that great team, and I figured I'd catch Harmon or talk to him a little later, but by the time I tried to find him again, he was gone. So I never met Harmon Killebrew. But again, like all Twins fans, I felt I knew him. A gracious, humble man that we in Minnesota were privileged to watch, who we were privileged to have represent our state. Thank you, Mr. President. And I yield the floor. I ask there's a note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okaka.
I ask unanimous consent that we now proceed to period of morning business. Senators allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to calendar number 49, S-Res 174.
The clerk will report.
Calendar 49, S-Res 174, expressing the sense of the Senate that effective sharing of passenger information from inbound international flight manifest and so forth.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection.
I ask consent that the resolution be agreed to, the Lieberman amendment, which is at the desk, to the preamble be agreed to, and the preamble as amended be agreed to. There be no intervening action or debate. Any statements related to this matter appear in the record at the appropriate place as if read.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to S-Res 189.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 189, recognizing and honoring Harmon Killebrew and expressing the condolences of the Senate to his family on his death.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
Mr. President, I will just make a very brief comment. I'm not a great baseball fan. I'm a baseball fan. I guess greatness is neither. I'm sure better fans than me. But I followed baseball all my life as a little boy. I listened to baseball games. And I would love to have been able to meet Harmon Killebrew, a man before anyone ever suggested steroids. It was so powerful. That holds, I think he's 10th or 11th in history of baseball for hitting home runs. What everyone says about him is such a nice man in addition to that. So I'm very happy to ask consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion we consider be laid on the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate now proceed to S-Res 190.
The clerk will report.
S-Res 190, recognizing the 100th anniversary of the Indianapolis 500-mile race.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion we consider be laid on the table.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate consent that the bill S-840 be discharged from the Committee on Environment and Public Works and referred to the Committee on Finance.
Without objection.
I've been told that S-1022 is due for its first reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the first time.
S-1022, a bill to extend expiring provisions of the USA Patriot Improvement and Reauthorization Act of 2005 and the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 until December 31st, 2014, and for other purposes.
Madam President, I now ask for second reading but object to my own request.
Objection having been heard, the bill will receive its second reading on the next legislative day.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, adjourn until 10 a.m. Thursday, May 19th. Following the burn, the pledge journal proceedings will be approved today. 1 hour will be deemed expired. The time for the two leaders will be reserved for the use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate proceed to pre-morning business until 11 a.m. The Senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or the designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half. The following morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session under the previous order.
Without objection.
Madam President, there will be a roll call vote tomorrow at about 2 p.m. on the motion to vote cloture on the nomination of Goodwin Liu of California to be United States Circuit Judge from the Ninth Circuit. Mr. President, there seems to be no one here asking for more time. If that, in fact, is the case, I ask that we adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Today in the Senate, members voted down an attempt to move forward a bill that would expand offshore oil and gas drilling. That measure originated in the House, and it failed to meet the 60-vote threshold.